friends of Partnership for Change. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to be here today and also to take part in this panel discussion. As I was listening to Roman and the previous speaker, I was reminded of some of the work that I did in Ukraine 8 years ago. 8 years ago, I had the pleasure of teaching democracy and transition studies at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Kiev. And I worked together with academicians in Ukraine, one Norwegian and a couple of other foreigners from Eastern Europe, and we compiled a volume on what things were like in Ukraine immediately after the Orange Revolution in 2004. And I shall recollect 3 points that were made in that specific volume. The first point was made by a distinguished professor at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. His name was Ryabov, and he was discussing a singly important issue, namely the right of the opposition to be the opposition. And he was discussing why there was no legal codification of what it meant to be an opposition in the Ukrainian system. And he even went beyond that by asking the question, how can the opposition be recognized as a political force? And in the sense of recognition that he was talking about, also meant the principle of power sharing, that one part of the political system can accept the fact that the other part of the political system comes to power. Now, if there's one thing we know about former Soviet Union and East European space, it's the fact that the idea of a regime which is based on power sharing is very weak amongst the elites and so forth. So this first principle, the rights of the opposition, that we discussed already in 2006, I think that is a very important lesson. And what we see play out in Ukraine during the last year, as the previous speaker was saying, is of course a reminder of the importance of those principles. But also a reminder that Ukrainian academicians were discussing this already at that time, and they seemed quite aware of the fact. The second point was lifted by a professor called Natalia Amelchenko. And she was discussing, and excuse me for being a bit abstract here, but she was discussing the principles of Jürgen Habermas in public discourse. And she coupled Jürgen Habermas to the idea of a public discourse around the Constitution, meaning the opening up of society in a civilized discourse on constitutional change and on the necessity of establishing firmly a constitution which does not only divide or sort of legitimize the system as such, but it also opens up for society to take part. Now it occurs to me when I look back that also this idea should be utilized in Ukraine today. Albeit we are facing a situation, as the previous speaker said, that constitutional amendments and constitutional change, although easily reducible to some changes that are not hard to implement, is really not on the table in Ukraine in the current situation. But this was on the table in 2006, which again informs me that already at that stage, academicians were aware of the fact that the civic culture, the informed public discussion, the shared partaking of civil society in state affairs was recognized in Ukraine as important. And the third point that was made in that short collection of articles from 2006 was the necessity of a European orientation in foreign politics and economics. And this was lifted by Anatoly Kruglashov in this volume. And he talked not only about the benefits of economic integration with Europe, he talked about Europeanness as an ideal as such. That becoming part of Europe would mean to have an integrated economy, would mean to allow for more innovation, more initiative, small or medium-sized businesses in Ukraine, and depart from the old system of the eastern part of subsidized mass industries, leftovers from the Soviet times. So that third point, economic integration and European politics, was also recognized by academicians in 2006. Since I teach history, I perhaps often tend to dwell too much on the past. But in our framework here today, if we can consider these 3 points as existing before the crisis, in the discursive space of what was Ukrainian politics at that time, we should also perhaps try, although difficult, to look beyond the current conflict and think, can these principles be raised again in the public discourse in Ukraine? I know that to be an extremely difficult exercise because, as Orlin said, although the idea of a shared society is an attractive one and one that we firmly believe in, it seems rather utopian, alas, to apply the principles of shared societies to Ukraine today, where you see this accumulation of the rhetoric of hatred and fear brewing in the country, in parts of the country. But anyways, to end on a slightly optimistic note, my hope is that the international society does not only make policies as to create incentives for Ukraine in the post-conflict situation, but that the international society also will be there to support Ukraine in a post-conflict situation. Henry Kissinger said that the test of policies is not how they begin, but how they end. So policies should be made also to look deeper into scenarios that follow 25th of May. And I do agree, maybe these were snap elections called too early. But when, if, how they are conducted, international society should still look beyond and try to adopt policies that can help stabilize and consolidate Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.